We were holding one of the church's first rallies for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights in the little Indiana town of 6,000 people where I was serving several years back now. Mostly the rally was about our work with partners to defeat an anti-marriage equality amendment that was being pushed through the state legislature, but that wasn't why she was there. The woman found me after the rally and told me she had a 13-year-old who was born biologically female, but who had insisted from 4 years old that he was male. Dressed in traditionally boys' clothes, identified as a boy. I had heard the mom's story through the grapevine, but hadn't yet met her. She didn't know anything about what it meant to be transgender when her baby was born. But she did her research and decided to let the child born biologically female express himself publicly as male. For fear for his safety, she pulled him out of his public school and sent him to school in the next town where no one would know him. Now, he was 13. She was facing decisions, they were facing decisions about whether to take hormones. She said she was grateful for the church's work to create a space in which it was okay to be who you authentically were. Maybe someday, she said, she wouldn't have to worry for her son's safety. Her story, I've come to understand, is all too common. And lately, these stories have become more widely known. A sitting president finally acknowledged publicly the existence of transgender people. Said the word transgender in the State of the Union speech, a big deal. President Obama recently appointed a transgender person to his Faith Advisory Council. In reaction to all the restroom bill nonsense, the administration sent, I guess I just gave myself away, didn't I? The administration sent a letter to every school district in the country instructing public schools to allow transgender students to use the restroom best matching their gender identity, the way many California schools have for years. Target has famously enacted that notion as policy in its stores, and though some say they're boycotting, Target reports no effect on sales thus far. One imagines anti-transgender legislators with fake mustaches and sunglasses sneaking into their local Target for Archway cookies. There's a batch of hateful bills making their way through state legislatures across the country. North Carolina seems to be the test state for trying to police who uses which restroom, though a public outcry has them reconsidering their position. The Department of Justice is suing North Carolina over the constitutionality of their bill. I'll say in a minute why I think Unitarian Universalists are uniquely called to weigh in publicly on transgender rights. But first, I want us to get on the same page, if we aren't already, about what we mean when we say transgender. This will be review for some and not for others. That's all okay. It's important to note that gender does not equal sex. A person's sex refers mostly to the genitals they were born with. But in our culture, sex and gender do get conflated. Both times, Heather and I were expecting a child. One of the first questions people would ask was, is it a boy or a girl? Since we could have answered that question by taking a snapshot with an ultrasound, it's clear that the answer to that question was about the biological equipment the baby was going to be born with. They were asking about our children's sex. Gender is something different. Yvonne Piper writes, if sex is the hardware of the body, then gender is the software. This is how a person identifies or feels in terms of man, woman, trans, or none of the above. People's gender identity may match their biological sex or not, end quote. There are a couple of important terms that relate specifically to gender. The preview CIS, from the Latin meaning on the same side, cisgender. So cisgender people are people like me whose biological sex matches their gender identity. In conversation this week with Alex Fuller, whom you'll meet in a moment, who was very generous and helpful with his time in thinking about this sermon, Alex said, if you don't know what cisgender means, you probably are cisgender. In other words, if your gender identity matches your biological sex, you may not have had to think much about this issue. Unlike cisgender, transgender, with the prefix trans coming from the Latin meaning across, refers to people whose gender identity and sex do not match. Many transgender men and women report that when their gender identity is revealed to a progressive person, that well-meaning person might say something like, "Oh, so good to meet you. I have gay friends who were married recently." Okay. Like biological sex, sexual preference is not the same as gender. The big win last year on marriage equality was wonderful. Transgender men and women's rights aren't the same thing. These are important distinctions. You may have read that daily life, or may have experienced, that daily life can be difficult for transgender women and men. Bathrooms are an especially vulnerable place. You may not remember, or you may, that the bathroom fight came to Arizona a couple years ago when, just after the city of Phoenix passed an ordinance banning discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, State Representative Kavanaugh introduced Arizona's version of a bathroom bill. It would have penalized people for not using the restroom that fit the gender assigned to them at birth. It would have been punishable by fines of over $2,000 and up to 6 months in jail. It didn't pass, but friends, it will be back. Mason Davis, the former executive director of the Transgender Law Center, was interviewed about that bill in 2013. This is Mason. He said on MSNBC, "It's incredibly damaging. It doesn't recognize the fact that many transgender people are part of America's fabric. It also doesn't recognize the realities of transgender life." He said, "I am a transgender man, which means that I grew up as a girl and transitioned later in life. I've now lived as a man most of my life. For most of your viewers, I'm guessing it's pretty clear which restroom I should use. Yet this bill would make it a criminal act for me to use the men's room." The bigger issue, he said, is that, quote, "this law would really encourage policing of everyone in the bathroom. It's the gender non-conforming people, like the soccer mom in sweatpants and a baseball cap, who are most likely to be targeted by this bill," end quote. With the most recent sweep of hate bills, there have already been stories about cisgender women being harassed by men who claim to be guarding the women's room to protect women. Cisgender people, can you imagine, as a transgender person, or a gender non-conforming conforming person in general, can you imagine, out of well-founded fear, regulating how much you drink before you go out, so you don't have to visit the restroom? For too many Americans, that's not something to imagine. It's real. There's so much fear being ginned up by cynical politicians. Fear that creates a transgender boogeyman, a man dressed as a woman coming into the restroom to peep on vulnerable women. There are no instances on record of that happening, though more than one cisgendered lawmaker has been arrested for preying on people in the restroom. More than anything, transgender folks aren't out to see you unclothed, and if you can be seen unclothed in a public restroom, you're probably doing it wrong anyway. People simply want to be free to present themselves with integrity and have a decent night out. But restrooms aren't the only places in which transgender people experience discrimination. They are sometimes denied housing and health care. Many times a transgender man or woman's documents are mismatched when it comes to gender, so their birth certificate might read female when their driver's license reads male. A trip to the hospital, then, for example, can be fraught with potential danger. Is the doctor going to make this visit all about my gender identity? Will I be a learning opportunity? Or worse, deny me care? On the intake form, do I list the hormones I'm taking when coming into the doctor's office for a sore throat? For these reasons and more, too many transgender people don't seek health care until it's an emergency, sometimes until it's too late. They're pushed to the margins of our society by discrimination, where poverty, homelessness, and physical intimidation are grave dangers. What's the result? The Washington Post reported part of it last January. 41% of transgender people surveyed in Injustice at Every Turn said they had attempted suicide. 41% of transgender people said they had attempted suicide, compared with 1.6% of the general population. The risk increased for those who reported bullying, sexual assault, and job loss. Analysis this year by the Williams Institute found 78% of transgender respondents who had endured physical or sexual violence at school had attempted suicide. Actress Laverne Cox, a transgender woman and an actor in the Netflix series Orange is the New Black, said during an interview with Time magazine last year, "We have to listen to people about who they are and not assume that there's something wrong with trans people, because we know who we are." And she said, "I think the biggest thing is folks want to believe that genitals and biology are destiny. When you think about it, that's kind of ridiculous," she said. "People need to be willing to let go of what they think they know about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman." End quote. We, I think, as people of liberal faith, are especially called to heed this advice. We who proclaim that every person has worth and dignity must create spaces in which those who are marginalized in our culture can be who they truly are and without fear. We are the descendants of the Universalists, present since at least the 2nd century CE and probably before, who proclaim that we're all held by a love much greater than we can imagine, equally held, equally loved, all children of that same love which some call God. We're descendants of the Transcendentalists, Margaret Fuller and Ralph Waldo Emerson and many more, who spoke of the divine within each and every person, leading them to believe that human beings can be trusted to decide our destinies and to know our own identities, each of which is precious, even holy. But in doing this work, sometimes we're fighting an old evolutionary tendency to group people quickly. Our brains want to assess whether a living being is a friend or a foe, and so when we hear about something unfamiliar, we have an immediate intuition. This is right, or this is wrong. This is acceptable, or this is not acceptable. We group quickly, often when we're not even aware of it. Here's one of the great challenges of liberal religion: to feel that intuition, to be aware of it, but rather than simply to act out of it automatically, to question it. Is my immediate reaction really right? This is the work of Unitarian Universalism, to keep our hearts open especially when ancient evolutionary tendencies want us to close them. We at VUU will continue to do that hard work. We won't always get it right. Those of us who are cisgender need to listen to trans voices and to do our own work of learning, not to expect our transgender loved ones to do it for us. But there are things we can do. One important action you can take is getting to know a trans person. If you're lucky enough to have a trans person in your life, take them to lunch and listen. And there's so much more to do. Write an op-ed in the newspaper. Volunteer with a local trans organization. Go to transequality.org and look at their list of more than 50 ways to be a good trans ally. There's something you can do. This morning during coffee hour, you can talk to Alex Fuller. Alex is a longtime activist and educator on trans issues, a transgender man who was so generous with his time in talking with me this week. and will be hanging out to speak to you after the service. Alex, can you stand so folks can see you? Thank you, Alex, for being here. Alex volunteered to do that. I said, Alex, are you sure? Alex said, yes, I'm sure, so thank you. The song we're about to sing asks a question. How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? It's in our Unitarian Universalist hymnal. We sing this song this morning with our transgender friends and all the people in our lives who are gender nonconforming in mind. How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? Let's sing that together.